So moving swiftly on, our next speaker is Stephen Jolly. Stephen is a construction worker and member of the Construction, Forestry and Mining Union in Australia. He's also the Socialist City Councillor of Yarra Council in Melbourne. He's just recently in 2016 elected to his third term, which is pretty amazing. Stephen has a long activist career. As a revolutionary, he was active in South Africa against Apartheid and later was active against the Mugabe regime. He was also in 1989 in the Tienanmen Square uprising in China, where he was active. And just recently, Stephen was the founding member of the Socialist Party of Australia and has only just recently moved to be a member of the Socialist, the same organisation Mel is a member of. Stephen.
Thank you. It's actually a fourth term. It was going to sound arrogant, but I'll just say that. I bring greetings to you and thank you to Socialist Voice for inviting myself and Mel from the Socialist Organisation in Australia. And I bring greetings to this conference from all our members in Australia, also from the rank and file of the CFMEU, which is probably the most militant and strongest union in Australia at the moment, and probably the strongest building industry union in the world right now. And also from the tens of thousands of people in the northern suburbs of Melbourne that I represent in the city of Yarra. I think that Australia is in the middle of being torn by, being contradicted by the #1 geopolitical struggle that's unfolding in the 21st century right now. And that's the struggle between the rising power of the state capitalist China on the one hand, and the economically decaying, but still military dominant USA. And every single issue in Australia right now, in fact in this part of the world right now, has to be seen through that prism. Originally, obviously, as you would be well aware, Australia was a colony of Britain, a dumping ground for its convicts. The wool and other raw materials were key to the development of the British Industrial Revolution. And obviously it was an outpost of white imperialism in this part of the world for British imperialism in the 1800s and in the 1900s. What we saw in the latter half of the 1800s was the development for the first time in Australia of industry and consequently of a working class. And in the 1850s, with the Eureka Uprising, the one and only armed uprising in Australia, the development of massive trade unions in Australia, the development of the huge industrial battles of the 1890s, we saw a conscious attempt made to cut across them by the ruling class, inspired by British colonial office on one hand, and the leadership of the new Labour Party and the trade union bureaucracy on the other, to have a class peace to buy off, if you like, the elite in Australia with federation in the beginning of the 20th century. Three-pronged agreement: tariffs to protect local industry, arbitration to have no strikes but wage rises through a third court, an industrial court, but most importantly a wide Australia policy where we saw the shameful eviction of Kanakis, of Chinese, of anyone who wasn't white from Australia over the course of the latter part of the 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century. That deal that came with federation at the beginning of the 20th century was strained in many occasions through the 20th century. The huge struggle in Australia against conscription, where alone amongst the Western powers, 2 referendums were lost to the left in a strange coalition with the Catholic Church twice against conscription, that we will not allow the cream of Australian youth to be sent to the killing fields of Europe. It was strained also in the 1930s with the class battles that were a consequence of the Great Depression, but nevertheless it kept together. After World War II, we saw UK imperialism being replaced by American imperialism, and in the latter half of the 20th century, Australia was a key ally and prop for American imperialism in this part of the world. We saw a breakdown of the White Australia policy. Why? Because of the brave struggles of the colonial and ex-colonial peoples of Asia, in China, in Vietnam, against imperialism, in Indonesia, against the Dutch, against the French, against the British, against American imperialism. And the ruling class in Australia decided that we don't populate, we will perish. And you saw, at first in a very hesitant way, but then in a much faster way, an infusion into Australia of people from the Mediterranean, from the Balkan regions, and people from all over the world, and in the 70s from Vietnam and East Asia itself. We saw the historic shift in world capitalism that Mel just spoke about, from Keynesianism in the post-war period to neoliberalism, beginning, roughly speaking, in the 70s and 80s, implemented in Australia, not by the Liberal National Party coalition, the right-wing parties, but by the Labor Party, because only the Labor Party could bring the unions along with them. Only the Labor Party had the influence over the trade union movement to convince them to sell out their wages and conditions, to implement neoliberal reforms. The Labor government of Hawke and Keating from 1983 to 1996 brought in HECS, which is student debt around the neck of young people in Australia for the rest of their life, brought in privatisation, brought in the opening up of Australia, getting rid of tariffs and the opening up to neoliberal relations. And it was no coincidence that that led to a devastating impact on the Australian economy. In the early 1990s, we had a really deep recession. The then Labor Treasurer, Paul Keating, said, "We are going to be the white trash of Asia." That was the perspective for Australian capitalism. And that didn't happen because China and the development of China cut across that process over the course of the next period. You saw in China that the opening up of the economy in 1980, with half the population of China, half the working population of China moving from the field to the factory. The greatest industrialization we saw on the planet since the Industrial Revolution meant that we saw a 25-year economic boom up until right now in Australia. It's unparalleled, with an insatiable demand from Chinese factories for Australian coal, for Australian iron ore that saved the backside of Australian capitalism over the course of the 25 years. Even the GFC of 2008, 2009, the massive stimulus package of the Chinese government led to Australia really not being hit by the GFC to the same degree as Europe, as Japan, as North America. But despite all of that, despite the fact that we've had a 25-year economic boom, on the ground, what we've seen is millions of working class people, millions of people of colour in Australia, particularly the Indigenous population, but many, many others as well, have been left behind by this economic boom. The top 10% of Australians now own the same wealth as the bottom 40%. The bottom 20% of Australians have got net negative income. They owe more than what they own. And the reason that this has happened is because the traditional party of the Australian working class, the Labor Party, were part and parcel not of the solution, but of the problem in driving through these reforms. The trade union movement, in overwhelmingly, not 100%, but 80 to 90%, changed from being organs of industrial fightback to being conveyor belts for neoliberalism into the factories, into the offices of Australia. We saw the Greens develop in the early part of this century, and they have become, unfortunately, a prop for the Labor Party, a junior partner in ALP coalitions, and really a party for the inner city elite, and totally incapable of getting a base in working class areas in Australia. And what that's meant now is that we've seen, as we all know, a beginning of an end of the mining boom in Australia. That's been partially cut across by a massive construction and property boom taking place in Australia right now. It's a South Sea bubble. It's totally artificial. And New Zealand too. It's based on changes to tax that encourage investment in housing by investors. Yes. Most houses and units that are now built in Australia are not built in Australia by tenants or owners who are going to live in them, but by investors from America, from China, from all over East Asia. I work in the construction industry. Almost every block of units, high-rise block of units that we build, is sold off the plan in advance at KL, in Shanghai, in Beijing, even before they're built. There's cranes all over the east coast of America. By the way, that's one of the reasons that the CFMEU, the building industry union, has maintained their power, because of the strength of the construction industry. We've just won a pay deal where we're getting a 5% pay rise every 1st of March for the next 4 years. In the context of world capitalism, that's a very, very rare occurrence. And that can only be explained by the construction boom. And that's the reason that the current Liberal government in Australia has brought in laws to try to smash the CFMEU that give shop stewards, union delegates and members of the CFMEU less rights than so-called terrorists. If they've got a FBI police force set up called the ABCC that can walk onto construction sites and arrest you and take you in, you do not have access to a lawyer. You do not have the right to silence. You have to tell them who voted last Tuesday at the lunchtime meeting to go on strike. If you do not give the names, you can be charged and jailed without access to a lawyer, without the right of silence. It's unbelievable the attempts that they're making to crush the last bastion of strong trade unionism in Australia at the present moment in time. And that construction boom is why, in the city that I come from in Melbourne, the population will very soon hit 5 million people. In Abbotsford, which is one particular suburb of where I represent, in 4 years, the population has doubled in size. It's absolutely ridiculous that in a city like Adelaide, with all due respect, probably the most boring city in the world, I think it's nobody here from Adelaide. See you, brother. The land value in Adelaide now equals New York. Now, I know where I prefer to live, with all due respect to South Australian wine. The median price for property in Sydney now is $1 million. And it's led to an horrific, in the middle of this construction boom, it's led to an horrific housing crisis. What an indictment of capitalism, that in the country of Australia, that if it was plonked on a map of Europe, would go from Moscow to Dublin, with the population of the Netherlands, in other words, an empty continent, we have homeless people. We have a housing crisis. What an indictment of modern capitalism. We have a situation now where no one can afford to buy a house unless you're super rich. We have a situation now where the rental market is so out of, it's just gone gangbusters. It's so expensive for young people to rent, especially in the inner city. 27% of rental properties now have got infestation of mice, of rats, of cockroaches, or whatever. People don't open their mouth about it in case they might get evicted. We have in one suburb that I represent, it's called Fitzroy, in the inner city of Melbourne, 4 rooming houses have been closed down in the last 2 years. Why? Because the owners have demolished them and turned them into trendy units for the elite. What happens to those people? Many of them are living on somebody's couch, and unfortunately many others are living on the streets right now in Australia. In Melbourne itself, every night dozens of people live on the street. Hundreds and thousands of people are homeless, but you don't see it because they're living thanks to the goodness of ordinary people in their spare rooms or in their couch and so on. And only in the last few months, the city of Melbourne, the neighbouring council to where I represent, run by the Liberals, run by the right wing, have brought in apartheid-style vicious laws to push out homeless people, to move them out of the city centre, because we don't want to look bad for the developers, for the tourists, and so on. And our organisation have played a very important role in fighting back against that. And we have said to the City of Melbourne, if you think you can pass a piece of paper in your fancy offices at the Town Hall in Melbourne to write off the homeless people of Melbourne, we'll all become homeless. We will start a political protest on the streets of Melbourne, similar to Occupy in New York and Melbourne in 2009, 2010, and we will occupy in solidarity with our sisters and brothers who are homeless, and we will take this fight right up to you. The other issue with housing is the total collapse in investment in public housing. Public housing in Australia now is going, there's absolutely no investment, and that's another reason we've got this crisis at the present moment in time. And therefore, for young people in Australia right now, the future is a lifetime of student debt if you have gone to TAFE or to university. It's a lifetime of low pay, of part-time work, of casual work, something that I'm sure that every young person in New Zealand can relate to. That is the future. My son is a third-year student at ANU in Canberra. And, I think what's going to happen, doesn't matter what degree he's going to get, he's going to be flipping burgers. He's going to be a barista. He's going to be stuck with a student debt around his neck. That's what the future holds for intelligent young people. And that, by the way, is something that we should turn on its head. Because every revolution, whether we're looking at what happened in North Africa and the Middle East a few years ago, 100 years ago in Russia, or any revolution really, has been led by frustrated young people who've decided the system offers them no future. So the future is ours on that basis. Now, this explains the anti-establishment mood we've got in Australia. The number one internal political contradiction for the Australian ruling class is the drive to implement neoliberal policies, the need to implement neoliberal policies, but the fact that they're deeply unpopular. And we have these one-term governments, and they can't get rid of elections, so they've got this horrendous difficulty at the present moment in time, as Mel touched on. And that is what the far right are trying to capitalise on with their racist populism, to try to divert attention away from the real issues, to blaming refugees and migrants and all this nonsense for the problems that that ordinary people face. The far left in Australia, most of the far left in Australia, have either retreated in a cowardly way to the campuses, or they've given up, or they've collapsed into the Greens, which are a petty bourgeois capitalist party, and that's the reality there. But what we have shown in Melbourne is that this is exactly the time when socialist ideas, socialist explanation, socialist analysis, but also socialist strategy and tactics are absolutely essential for the campaigns that will burst out into action, with or without socialists. People will be forced and are beginning to fight back over the course of the past period. The reason that I was elected in 2004 as the first socialist councillor in Australia for 50 years was very simple. Is because in the period before that, we had integrated and been part of and led huge community battles in that particular part of Melbourne. The struggle to stop school closures. We sat for a year in Richmond Secondary College, occupied it. We stood up to police baton charges. We stood up to being sued by $1.5 million. We put on picket lines, and after a year of struggle, we forced the then Liberal government of Jeff Kennett to negotiate, and we won that battle. We established 20 years ago the community campaign for heroin reform, because in that area there's a massive drug problem where zero tolerance is not working, and we need a reform in drug policy. And that was why we got the trust of enough people. We scraped in on the third spot to win that spot back in 2004. And I think it's very, very important to understand what our day-to-day political work is in Melbourne right now. Yes, it's the basics. We have a weekly stall and stalls. Yes, we bring out magazines. Yes, every Sunday we have a rolling series of street meetings in different parts of the municipality so the pundits can come along, tell you what their issues are. On a weekly basis every Sunday, we bring out a newsletter every 6 months for free, in colour, to letterbox to everybody's house. But more important than any of that, we have been involved and led and made ourselves relevant to, therefore, the huge campaigns that are taking place. Number one, for example, on planning issues. Now, when I became a socialist councillor, after speaking at Tienanmen Square and fighting Mugabe and all the rest of it, I found planning, it was like Valium. You know, don't need Valium, just give me the planning papers. I thought it was the most boring thing in world history, but I just had to do it. It was just an overhead expense of being the first socialist councillor. I couldn't fuck it up, if I can put it like that. I had to, put up a good, for all socialists, I had to make sure I didn't mess it up. But it is an extremely political question, because they're like colonialists in a way. These developers have come in with their fat checks. They're buying up inner city land. They're trying to get their hands on parks and sports areas, pushing out rooming houses, pushing out public housing, pushing out the poor, and turning it into apartments. I have to say, I forgot to mention the point, that for every homeless person in Melbourne, there are 3 empty units. So this housing boom, they're largely empty. People aren't living in them. I mean, what an argument for socialism. People say, what would you do under socialism? We would put the homeless people into any one of the 3 empty units that they could have each. Let them choose and we'll sell the other 2 or whatever. That's what socialism is for housing at a very basic level. We've been involved in many planning applications, planning battles, where we forced the developers in many instances and the government to say, if you're going to build 20 stories, we want a percentage of low-cost housing. We want to ensure that as the population increases and the units increase, we have more childcare, more schools, more kindergartens and all the rest of it. These are real issues that people are involved in, that we've led over the course of the past 13 years. In the inner city, 20% of the people aren't rich. Yes, it's gentrified, but they are stuck in public housing. And they are overwhelmingly from Africa, from Vietnam, and from China. And in those 3 massive public housing estates in the area that I represent, they have problems. You talk about first world problems. They've got problems that you would not believe. You've got single mums straight off the plane from Sudan, living next to an ice dealer or a pill press. The kids can't study because of the noise 24 hours a day. Often a lot of the dealers take possession of the laundries on every floor, because if you can open up the heater, you get 24-hour heat. You can use the sink to do your gear, and they can't wash their clothes. The schools in the inner city don't want African kids in there because they don't bring money with them. They look bad, you know, like the trainees in the inner city, they hate racism, except if they have to live next door to a black person. So we've had to have huge fights against the government who have tried, for example, on the Fitzroy estate and the North Richmond estate, to take the open space, the playgrounds, which is, because these, obviously they're flats, they don't have a garden. This is where these people play. This is where these kids play football, play basketball, and they've tried to wipe that out, and we've had to fight back against that. We've led the momentous battle on the East-West Tunnel campaign that Mel played a key role with. And on Wednesday night, just gone, 2 nights ago, we had a huge public meeting on the issue of drugs, because in my area, it's the centre of the ice and the heroin industry. And because the government refuses to bring in a safe injecting facility, people are shooting up on the street. So obviously for residents, there's needles, there's all types of stuff. But 34 people died, human beings died last year because of overdose alone. What a horrible way to have to go. When we know in Sydney, where a safe injecting facility was implemented 20 years ago, not a single person has died of an OD thanks to that injecting facility. Yeah. But the Labour government in Victoria think that they get some votes, and they look like a law and order government. So what they do is they put lives, and they put votes ahead of lives. How do these people get out of bed in the morning? This is what and we have launched a campaign on that issue, but also on the issue of pill testing. We've had a whole bunch of young people dying in festivals in Melbourne this year because of dodgy pills. We want pill testing, we want a safe injecting facility. We've set up a funding fund, and we've said to the government, if you don't come back in the next short period of time and you turn in your policy, we have nurses and doctors, brave nurses and doctors. We will establish our own illegal safe injecting facility, illegal testing facility, because we will not let our young people continue to die on the streets of Melbourne, a lonely, horrible death because of your policies. These are the type of campaigns that our socialist organisation in Melbourne have been involved in. And that is why in 2008 we got re-elected, 2012 and 16 at the last election. I got the highest vote in Victoria, but what was very interesting, we got 1 in 5 of the votes, which for an openly revolutionary socialist organisation in a country that's just gone through 25 years of boom, it's quite unusual. We got more votes than the Labour Party. Think about that. We got more votes than the Labour Party. The city centre of Melbourne was the home, was the place where the Labour Party was founded. This shows that these ideas aren't just airy-fairy, but can be implemented. We have come here today, we have come here this weekend to show solidarity with Socialist Voice, and we want you to work with us. We want to work with all our brothers and sisters in this country and throughout the region to build, as we have to do, as this world is opening up to struggle, a new type of left alternative that's going to take advantage and not make the mistakes of the past, not to sell out, not to be sucked into the trappings of office. And if we do that together, we can be very, very sure that in the period ahead, we can put capitalism in the dustbin of history. Thank you.